the 22nd of September 1944. The Philippine Sea lay under a ceiling of gray clouds, the kind that swallowed entire squadrons and hid carriers until the last possible moment. Below that shifting curtain of weather, an American fleet pushed through rough water, its lead carrier throwing white spray off its bow as it cut a straight line toward the western horizon. Far above it, a group of Japanese pilots broke through a patch of thinning cloud and saw the silhouette of a lone carrier beneath them. At first glance, its long, flat deck and clean profile looked familiar, similar to the armored British carriers they had trained to attack earlier in the war. British ships were heavily protected, tough targets, survivable, but they lacked the concentrated, layered defenses the Americans were known for. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Still, the pilots assumed they had time. They believed they understood the kind of ship they were looking at. They were wrong. As the formation tightened to begin its descent, the first bursts of American anti-aircraft fire reached them. It wasn't scattered or probing. It came in dense, rising walls of explosions, patterns so thick that one pilot later described it as flying into iron rain. The American carrier below wasn't waiting to identify the threat. Its radar had already framed the incoming shapes. Its fire control teams had tracked them through the clouds, and its gunners were prepared long before the attackers even saw the ship's deck. The lead Japanese pilot tried to steady his dive angle, expecting the kind of return fire they associated with British escort groups. Instead, the sky erupted around him. Black bursts snapped against his canopy. Metal fragments tore past the wings. One explosion lit so close that it rolled his aircraft to the side and nearly forced him out of formation. He realized instantly that something was different. The rate of fire, the accuracy, the timing. This wasn't the response of a British armored carrier. This was something far more dangerous. Below, the American carrier surged forward, its deck crew moving with mechanical precision as more gun emplacements opened fire. Each mount tracked independently, yet moved in perfect synchronization, forming overlapping kill zones that grew tighter with every second. The pilots could see the pattern now, how the American ship created a sphere of danger rather than a line of defense. The Japanese formation wavered. They weren't even in attack range yet, and already they were losing control of the sky. In that moment, long before the first bomb fell, many of them understood why veteran aviators warned against approaching American carriers directly. It wasn't the ship's armor that made it terrifying. It was everything else. The carrier, cutting across the Philippine Sea that morning, held a position far more critical than the pilots above understood, because it served as the forward anchor of an American task force, pushing steadily toward Japanese-held waters, where every mile gained tightened the pressure on enemy supply lines. Although it appeared alone from the air, the ship was actually the central hinge of a layered formation spread beyond the visible haze, with destroyers screening ahead, cruisers guarding the flanks, and submarines patrolling the distant edges of the fleet's operating radius. Every movement of the carrier shaped the actions of the entire formation, dictating when fighter patrols launched, where reconnaissance aircraft swept, and how the surface escorts prepared for incoming strikes. For the Americans below deck, the mission carried enormous weight, because losing this single vessel would immediately fracture the fleet's ability to project air power, leaving convoys exposed, and opening a hole wide enough for enemy aircraft to exploit across hundreds of miles. The carrier wasn't merely a floating runway, it was the air command center for the entire push, issuing orders to pilots, directing interceptions, and managing the complex choreography of aircraft recovery under combat pressure. Removing it from the battle would cripple the fleet's offensive rhythm and force the escorts to retreat into a defensive shell. Japanese strategists had long understood the strategic value of sinking an American carrier, yet many underestimated the level of coordination that protected these ships, imagining that a single well-timed dive bomb run could break the formation and scatter the rest of the task force. In reality, the Americans operated using a system built on overlapping responsibilities, radar teams scanning the horizon, fire control crews predicting attack angles, and fighter squadrons intercepting threats before they reached their dive point. This interlocked network transformed the carrier into the most formidable target in the Pacific, even more intimidating than the armored decks of the British Royal Navy. The Japanese pilots descending toward the American ship that morning were unaware that they were approaching a vessel specifically designed to survive in open ocean battles that demanded mobility, rapid recovery, and relentless counterfire. Unlike British carriers, which relied heavily on thick armor to endure direct hits, American carriers emphasized range, sortie rate, and distributed defense, using multiple ships to create a deadly umbrella of firepower. This philosophy meant that as long as the carrier stayed afloat and in motion, the task force remained operational, allowing American squadrons to strike far beyond the reach of enemy bases. The stakes grew even higher because the surrounding waters acted as a bottleneck for both sides, with Japan attempting to maintain supply corridors while American forces pressed forward to sever them permanently. If the Japanese pilots succeeded, they could stall the American advance long enough to reinforce several vulnerable island garrisons, buying time that Tokyo desperately needed. If they failed, the carrier group would continue carving deep into territory. The Japanese Navy could no longer adequately defend, accelerating an inevitable collapse. Every man aboard the American ship understood that reality. Feeling the weight of the mission in the constant rumble of engines, the shouted commands along the catwalks, and the steady rotation of anti-aircraft mounts searching for targets. Their survival depended not only on the thickness of steel beneath their feet, but on the precision of their teamwork and the speed of their reactions. As the incoming Japanese squadron tightened its formation overhead, the crews braced for the first wave of an attack that could decide the future of the entire campaign, knowing that the fate of the fleet and perhaps the direction of the war hinged on the next few minutes. The first signs of the incoming attack emerged as faint specks above the cloud layer, gradually sharpening into recognizable silhouettes that confirmed what the radar operators had already reported, prompting the carrier's flight deck crew to shift instantly from controlled efficiency to full combat readiness. As the shapes resolved into a descending formation of Japanese aircraft, the fire control teams fed continuous data into their targeting systems, calculating angles and trajectories while adjusting for wind, turbulence, and the unpredictable dive patterns of experienced enemy pilots. The gunners along the starboard side watched the formation tighten, seeing how the attackers aligned themselves for a classic high-angle approach that relied on speed, surprise, and the narrow window before American fighters could scramble to intercept. Despite the tension rising across the ship, the crew moved with practiced coordination, each man performing his assigned task as anti-aircraft mounts elevated, ammunition handlers secured fresh belts, and spotters relayed distance markers through clipped, deliberate radio calls that traveled cleanly through the ship's communication network. The Japanese formation began its descent with disciplined precision, banking in a controlled arc designed to generate maximum velocity before committing to the sharp vertical dive that would carry them directly toward the carrier's forward deck. The pilots understood the risks, but believed that speed could shield them during the crucial first seconds of their attack run, allowing them to outpace the initial bursts of defensive fire and deliver their ordnance before the Americans could bring their heaviest guns to bear. The illusion of safety shattered the moment the first American shells burst among them, scattering black smoke that obscured visibility and forced several pilots to correct their angles mid-dive, a dangerous maneuver at such high speeds. The lead pilot felt the shockwave ripple across his cockpit, shaking the aircraft violently as fragments of metal clattered against the fuselage and rattled along the wings, reminding him of the deadly accuracy that distinguished American gunners from their British counterparts. He fought to stabilize his aircraft, but every correction cost precious altitude and broke the clean geometry of his intended dive path, leaving him exposed to the overlapping arcs of fire that rose in increasingly dense patterns from the carrier below. As the formation pressed downward, the Americans adapted their fire in real time, shifting to predictive tracking that targeted where the aircraft would appear rather than where they had been moments earlier, creating lethal funnels that narrowed the attackers' approach lanes to dangerously thin corridors. The crew operating the midship guns saw the Japanese planes slicing through the clouds and fired in disciplined bursts, maintaining spacing between each volley to avoid overheating their barrels, while still providing a steady curtain of fire that the enemy pilots struggled to navigate. Even the carrier's light mounts contributed to the intensity, peppering the air with rapid tracer lines that brightened the sky and gave the descending aviators a terrible impression of diving into a storm of molten light. One Japanese pilot attempted to shift to a lateral entry, hoping to slip beneath the heaviest fire and swing across the carrier's deck at a shallow angle. Yet the Americans adjusted within seconds, saturating his new path with explosive shells that rocked his aircraft and forced him to pull away before completing the maneuver. Another pilot near the rear of the formation lost control entirely when a burst detonated off his right wing, sending fragments through the control surfaces and causing the plane to tumble into an uncontrolled spiral that ended in a plume of water beside the carrier's wake. Each failure intensified the pressure on the remaining pilots, who now understood that the ship they had mistaken for a softer target was responding with a ferocity far greater than anticipated. The first contact had become more than an exchange of fire. It was the moment when the Japanese squadron realized the battlefield dynamic had shifted, confronting a level of defensive coordination that undermined their assumptions and forced them to reconsider every tactic they had prepared. The carrier's gun spoke with unbroken discipline, revealing the fatal flaw in the attacker's expectations and setting the stage for the cascade of decisions and mistakes that would follow as the battle unfolded. The first catastrophic moment arrived when the lead Japanese pilot, still fighting to maintain the correct dive angle, caught a sudden flash of white along his left wing as a high-velocity shell burst just inches away, sending a spray of metal fragments through the aileron and instantly robbing him of the responsiveness he needed to survive the steep descent. He gripped the controls harder, feeling the stick tremble in his hands as the plane began to yaw unpredictably, forcing him to overcorrect in a desperate attempt to hold the narrow window of attack open for even a few more seconds. The cockpit filled with the harsh chemical smell of burning paint and the dull thud of debris striking the fuselage, each impact reminding him that the American fire control teams were not merely estimating his position but calculating it with frightening precision. As he struggled to stabilize the aircraft, a second explosion erupted beneath the right wing, generating a violent shockwave that pushed the nose upward and momentarily blinded him with a burst of oily smoke that smeared across his canopy. The sudden shift in attitude caused his bomb to rattle dangerously within its mounting rack, creating a vibration that sent a jolt through the airframe and triggered a surge of fear he hadn't felt in any previous attack run. He attempted to clear the smoke by banking slightly, but the damaged control surfaces refused to respond smoothly, forcing him into a shallow, uncontrolled drift that carried him away from the precise dive corridor required to hit the carrier's forward deck. Below him, the carrier's anti-aircraft batteries continued their relentless cadence, adjusting their fire with mechanical efficiency as new data streamed through the ship's targeting network, allowing gunners to anticipate his faltering trajectory and saturate the region he attempted to escape into. The sky around him became a chaotic field of explosions, each burst expanding with vicious force and scattering fragments that clattered loudly against his canopy, filling his peripheral vision with sparks that made it impossible to focus on the horizon. Despite the chaos, he forced himself to keep descending, believing that abandoning the dive would doom the rest of his squadron by leaving them exposed without the distraction he was creating. The plane shuddered violently as another fragment struck the engine cowling, producing a shrill metallic screech that cut through the roar of the wind and convinced him that the engine might seize at any moment. His vision blurred from the accumulated shockwaves, and a thin line of blood began to drip from his scalp where a fragment had pierced the cockpit frame before grazing his head. He wiped the blood aside with the back of his glove, but the movement only caused the aircraft to wobble further, revealing how little control he still possessed over the failing machine. Behind him, several members of the squadron witnessed his descent deteriorating and realized with growing dread that the American carrier was shredding their formation far earlier than expected, breaking the cohesion they relied upon to survive the initial approach. One wingman attempted to slide into position to cover him, but the density of the defensive fire made coordination nearly impossible, forcing each pilot to choose between self-preservation and maintaining formation discipline. The wingman hesitated too long, and a burst detonated between them, throwing his aircraft into a sharp roll that severed any hope of supporting the wounded leader. The lead pilot's final attempt to correct his dive failed when the damaged aileron fully locked, causing the aircraft to pitch uncontrollably toward the starboard side and sending him tumbling out of the attack corridor entirely. He felt the controls go slack as the plane rolled past a critical angle, and in those last moments of clarity, he understood that his aircraft was no longer a weapon but a falling wreck, destined to crash long before reaching the carrier's deck. His failure rippled through the formation, disrupting timing, breaking discipline, and forcing every remaining pilot to adjust their attack paths under conditions that were rapidly becoming fatal. The catastrophic wound inflicted upon the leader was more than a single loss. It shattered the rhythm of the squadron, exposed the fragility of their approach, and demonstrated with unmistakable brutality that the American carrier was not merely resisting the attack, but actively dismantling it before the enemy could even release their bombs. The sudden loss of their leader forced the remaining Japanese pilots into a moment of perilous uncertainty, yet the deputy flight commander, flying slightly above the disintegrating formation, understood that hesitation would only tighten the American defensive net and doom every man still committed to the dive. He steadied his breathing as he evaluated the chaos below, recognizing that the carefully rehearsed attack pattern had collapsed, but also realizing that retreat would invite the pursuing American fighters to strike them during their climb, turning a difficult situation into a slaughter. His instinct urged him to pull back and regroup, yet a deeper sense of duty compelled him to restore structure before the defensive fire completely shattered their offensive rhythm. Despite the spiraling smoke from the downed leader's aircraft, he pushed his own plane into a sharper angle, adjusting the dive path in a way that defied conventional doctrine by intentionally approaching from a steeper line that reduced exposure time but heightened the difficulty of bomb release. This decision, made in a fraction of a second, marked a break from the standardized training that emphasized predictable dive trajectories intended to preserve formation integrity. He knew the Americans were tracking the formation's expected approach vectors, and by diverging sharply, he hoped to slip through a momentary blind spot in their fire control calculations. As he angled downward, he signaled the two nearest pilots with a quick wing rock, instructing them to tighten behind him in a staggered formation that would concentrate their remaining firepower while minimizing the risk of overlapping dive paths. The maneuver required immediate trust and flawless execution, yet both pilots responded without hesitation, shifting into position despite the swirling turbulence created by the ongoing anti-aircraft bursts that erupted around them. Their engines screamed under the strain as they accelerated into the new path, following their commander with a fidelity born from countless hours of practice and an unspoken understanding that boldness was the only bridge left between survival and failure. Below them, American gunners detected the altered approach and attempted to pivot their tracking mounts, but the new angle forced the defenders to realign their calculations while maintaining a barrage on the rest of the fragmented formation, stretching the layered defense to its limits. The commander sensed the brief hesitation in the defensive rhythm and pushed harder, feeling the aircraft vibrate under the increased speed as the wind tore across his canopy in violent gusts. His eyes burned from the smoke drifting upward, yet he kept the carrier locked in his sights, focusing on the forward deck where he intended to place his bomb in one decisive strike. The pressure mounted as he neared the midpoint of the dive, because any further deviation from the path would force him to abort the run entirely, abandoning the remaining pilots who had placed their trust in his daring maneuver. He tightened his grip on the controls, reminding himself that their chances depended on acting unpredictably, disrupting the American system by choosing a line so aggressive that it fell outside the standard attack geometry the defenders were trained to counter. It was a desperate gamble, but one forged from experience and sharpened by the realization that conventional tactics had already failed catastrophically. Behind him, the accompanying pilots fought the turbulence with clenched jaws and determined focus, aware that every second held the possibility of being struck by fragments or swept out of the sky by a calculated burst. Yet the commander's determination fueled their resolve, drawing them deeper into a collective effort that transcended fear and transformed their fractured squadron into a cohesive spearpoint aimed directly at the carrier's heart. Their aircraft descended with increasing speed, slicing through layers of smoke and shrapnel as they committed fully to the unconventional path that now represented their only remaining chance. In choosing to lead the dive despite overwhelming danger, the commander created a moment where individual will overcame tactical collapse, reasserting control over a battlefield dominated by American precision. His decision, born from both desperation and calculated defiance, set the tone for what remained of the attack, proving that even in the face of devastating losses, the resolve could reshape the flow of battle and grant the surviving pilots a fleeting opportunity to strike back against the impenetrable wall rising from the sea below. Long before the squadron committed to its attack, Japanese planners had operated under a widespread assumption that American carriers, despite their formidable air groups, possessed defensive patterns similar to the British vessels encountered earlier in the war, which relied heavily on armored decks rather than dense layers of coordinated firepower. This misconception had seeped into training manuals, squadron briefings, and even the personal confidence of many aircrews, shaping their expectations in ways that would prove dangerously outdated when confronted with the evolving doctrine of the U.S. Navy. The belief that a determined dive bomber formation could punch through Western carrier defenses without encountering overwhelming resistance had once held some truth, but the Americans had spent years refining their response systems to levels far surpassing anything the Japanese intelligence reports had acknowledged. As the commander and the remaining pilots cut deeper into their dive, The consequences of that flawed understanding became painfully clear because the defensive perimeter they had anticipated was nowhere near as static or linear as their models suggested. Instead of a single wall of fire rising predictably from the ship's midsection, they faced a constantly shifting matrix of overlapping targeting zones that adjusted fluidly as each gun mount fed new data into the fire control network. The carrier's defenders were not simply reacting to the dive, they were anticipating it, predicting where each aircraft would be a second into the future, and placing explosive bursts precisely where the pilots least expected them. This discrepancy between expectation and reality struck the pilots with greater force than any single explosion, because every moment spent navigating the storm of defensive fire revealed how deeply they had underestimated the Americans' capacity to coordinate multiple weapons systems simultaneously. They had assumed that once they broke through the initial barrage, the defensive pattern would thin, allowing them to commit to the dive with minimal interference. Instead, the intensity increased as they descended, creating the paradoxical sensation that the carrier grew more dangerous the closer they approached it, contradicting the long-held doctrine that emphasized striking decisively during the final seconds of the dive. Compounding the problem was the belief that American gunners struggled to track fast-moving aircraft during the steepest portion of the descent, a weakness that Japanese pilots had exploited effectively against older Allied ships earlier in the conflict. Yet the carrier below them demonstrated none of that vulnerability, because its centralized fire control system allowed multiple batteries to adjust their aim with near-instant synchronization, removing the gaps that experienced dive bombers relied upon to complete their runs. Instead of slipping through fragmented defenses, the Japanese aviators found themselves squeezed into a tightening funnel, where every meter lost to gravity amplified the precision of the incoming bursts. For the commander leading the dive, this revelation arrived in a crushing moment of clarity, as he watched tracer fire bend toward him with almost predictive intent, as if the Americans were reading his movements before he fully committed to them. The realization that their doctrine had failed, that every assumption underlying their attack had been built on outdated intelligence, struck him with a weight heavier than the physical stress of the dive. He had trained under the belief that American carriers were vulnerable during the narrow window between detection and impact, yet the vessel beneath him displayed a level of preparedness that transformed that window into an execution zone. The pilots behind him experienced the same dawning comprehension, recognizing that their approach vectors had been mapped, memorized, and countered by a defensive system capable of turning even minor deviations into fatal mistakes. Their training emphasized boldness and commitment, insisting that hesitation invited disaster. Yet here, boldness itself was becoming the trap, because it locked them into predictable trajectories that the carrier's gunners had already integrated into their calculations. The more aggressively they pressed the dive, the more precisely the Americans responded, creating a feedback loop that eroded every advantage the squadron believed it possessed. In that sweeping moment of realization, as fire continued to rise in lethal blossoms around them, the squadron understood that their greatest vulnerability was not the shrinking altitude or the failing accuracy of their dive, but the simple, devastating truth that they had entered the battle armed with the wrong understanding of their enemy. Their tactical misconceptions had transformed an already dangerous mission into a near impossible one, leaving them to fight not only against the American carrier, but against the consequences of their own outdated beliefs, which now eroded their confidence with every desperate second of the descent. The deeper the squadron pushed into its increasingly unstable dive, the more violently the contrast between Japanese expectations and American engineering asserted itself, revealing a defensive ecosystem far more advanced than anything their intelligence briefings had ever described or prepared them to face. Unlike the British carriers, whose armored decks absorbed damage at the cost of reduced anti-aircraft saturation, the American ship relied on a philosophy that prioritized layered detection, rapid communication, and coordinated lethality over passive resilience. This approach meant that every component of the carrier's defense, from the radar operators scanning the horizon to the smallest gun crew positioned along the catwalks, contributed to a single, unified kill chain designed to intercept enemy aircraft long before they reached their bombing angles. At the foundation of this system stood the ship's radar suite, which provided a level of early warning capability the Japanese pilots found astonishingly accurate, because it tracked not only their altitude and heading, but also the subtle changes in formation spacing as the dive began. This early detection fed directly into the fire control computers, allowing the entire defensive network to anticipate the squadron's descent with a precision that rendered traditional evasive techniques nearly useless. While Japanese doctrine relied heavily on the element of surprise, The Americans had constructed a battlefield where surprise was nearly impossible, leaving the attackers exposed from the moment they pierced the cloud layer and revealed even the faintest outline of their wings. Supporting this predictive layer were the carrier's gunners, who operated in tightly integrated teams that communicated through wired intercoms, unaffected by the interference and static that plagued radio-based coordination on many Japanese vessels. These crews adjusted their aim in near real time, interpreting the constant flow of data from the fire control systems and translating it into disciplined firing patterns that shifted seamlessly as the descending aircraft altered their trajectories. The gunners were trained not merely to shoot at targets, but to work as components within a synchronized defensive organism, each mount covering the blind spots of another, so that no section of the sky remained unprotected for more than a heartbeat. The American philosophy extended further with the integration of multiple shell types, allowing gunners to tailor their ammunition to specific altitudes and approach vectors, using fragmentation bursts to disrupt high-level entries and heavier explosive rounds to punish aircraft attempting to correct their dive angles during the final seconds of descent. This adaptability contrasted sharply with Japanese expectations, which assumed the defenders would be limited to a narrower selection of munitions, making it easier to exploit timing gaps. Instead, the attackers found themselves confronted with a defensive curtain that not only detected and tracked them, but also responded dynamically to their movements, closing every gap almost as soon as it appeared. Compounding these challenges was the carrier's fighter combat air patrol, which, although momentarily out of position due to the sudden onset of the dive, remained a constant threat, lingering just beyond visual range. The Japanese pilots knew that even if they survived the carrier's anti-aircraft fire, the American fighters would likely intercept them during their climb-out, making a successful escape nearly impossible unless they delivered a decisive blow during the dive itself. This looming danger pressed on their nerves as heavily as the defensive fire, reminding them that the ship below was not an isolated target but a node within a vast, deadly network of coordinated assets. The final piece of the American system, and perhaps the most demoralizing, was the carrier's damage control doctrine, which emphasized rapid response, decentralized decision-making, and continuous crew training, ensuring that even a successful strike would be met with an immediate, disciplined effort to contain damage and preserve operational capability. The Japanese pilots understood that landing a hit was only the beginning, because American crews had repeatedly proven their ability to extinguish fires, repair flight decks, and restore combat readiness long before Japanese aircraft could return for follow-up attacks. This knowledge added a psychological weight to the dive, because it meant that only a perfectly placed bomb could meaningfully impact the battle, and anything less would be absorbed by the ship's resilient infrastructure and expertly coordinated crew. As the squadron continued its desperate descent toward the carrier's forward deck, the combined effect of these systems became undeniable, revealing a defensive architecture that outmatched their assumptions at every turn and underscored the fatal truth that the Americans had transformed the modern carrier into a fortress, not through armor alone, but through a synergy of technology, training, and doctrine that rendered traditional dive bomb tactics terrifyingly obsolete. As the squadron plunged into the most perilous stretch of its dive, the sky between them and the carrier transformed into a chaotic corridor of smoke, shrapnel, and rising fire that demanded constant corrections merely to keep the aircraft pointed in the general direction of the target. The deputy commander maintained his steep trajectory despite the growing turbulence, forcing his body to endure brutal G-forces as he struggled to hold the controls steady while explosions bloomed so close that fragments skittered across his canopy in flashes of silver light. Each new burst threw distorted reflections across the glass, creating the unnerving illusion that the air itself was splintering around him, further tightening the psychological pressure already weighing on every movement he made. Behind him, the two pilots who had committed to his unorthodox path fought to keep their aircraft aligned, despite the punishing crosswinds generated by overlapping shockwaves from the American guns, which detonated with a rhythm so precise it resembled a mechanical heartbeat echoing across the sky. Their engines screamed in protest as they attempted to match the commander's angle while avoiding the debris streaming from damaged aircraft elsewhere in the formation, including fragments of metal and burned fabric that twisted through the air like lethal confetti. The men knew that falling out of alignment meant losing the brief window created by their leader's daring maneuver, yet maintaining position required an almost instinctive balance between aggression and restraint. The central portion of the dive tightened into a deadly funnel, where every meter gained brought the pilots deeper into the overlapping envelopes of American fire, forcing them to weave through bursts with reflexes sharpened by fear and necessity. The commander felt the aircraft lurch violently as a near miss detonated beneath his left wing, sending a shockwave that rattled his teeth and momentarily blurred his vision, yet he refused to deviate from the path, because altering his descent now would scatter his formation and eliminate any remaining hope of delivering a coordinated strike. Instead, he leaned into the momentum, allowing the gravitational pull to carry him closer to the deck, even as the incoming fire intensified to a level that would have shattered the confidence of a less experienced pilot. As they neared the final third of the dive, the American gunners shifted to a more aggressive firing pattern designed specifically to disrupt last-second corrections, sending a dense curtain of explosive rounds directly across the projected bomb release point. The commander recognized the tactic immediately, understanding that the defenders sought to force him into a premature release or panic maneuver that would ruin the accuracy of the drop. He gritted his teeth and held his course, watching the carrier's deck rise sharply in his sights as the ship executed a subtle turn, intended to throw off his aim, a defensive technique the Japanese rarely encountered with such impeccable timing. The two supporting pilots mirrored his determination, narrowing their dive angles as they entered the critical window, where one clean release could still overcome the overwhelming disadvantage imposed by the carrier's defenses. Their cockpits shook violently as they passed through the densest segment of the barrage, each explosion threatening to snap control surfaces or damage vital components that would send them falling short of the target. Yet both men pressed deeper, driven by the knowledge that retreat was now impossible, and that survival depended entirely on maintaining the pressure long enough for at least one of them to break through the defensive line. The commander finally reached the release point, sensing the precise moment through a combination of instinct, training, and the subtle cues embedded in the visual rise of the carrier's bow. He released the bomb with a sharp pull of the toggle, immediately feeling the aircraft lighten even as fresh bursts erupted around him, tracing rapid arcs across the air with murderous intent. Without waiting to confirm the bomb's trajectory, he pulled into a brutal recovery maneuver that slammed him back into his seat, forcing his vision to narrow as the G-forces surged and the aircraft strained to avoid crashing into the sea. Behind him, the supporting pilots followed suit with near-simultaneous releases, their bombs dropping in tight succession as they attempted to escape the final wave of fire that sought to tear their aircraft apart during the climb-out. The carrier's gunners continued firing relentlessly, adjusting their aim to track the ascending silhouettes, while the rising smoke momentarily obscured the results of the attack. The dive was over, but the battle was far from finished, because every man who survived the initial strike now faced the harrowing challenge of escaping the American fighters that would soon descend upon them with merciless speed. The sequence ended not with triumph or clarity, but with a tense, breathless uncertainty that settled over the surviving pilots as they pulled away from the carnage, knowing that whatever damage they had inflicted, if any, would become clear only after they survived the gauntlet that awaited them above the roiling sea. As the surviving pilots clawed their way out of the dive, the psychological impact of the carrier's defenses settled over them with a weight far heavier than the physical strain of the maneuver, because each man now understood that the Americans had countered their attack with a level of precision and ferocity far beyond anything they had anticipated. The commander felt his hands trembling on the controls as he leveled the aircraft, not from exertion but from the realization that the defensive fire had tracked him with an almost uncanny awareness, responding to every adjustment he made as though the gunners had anticipated his movements before he executed them. This uncanny sense of being watched, measured, and systematically hunted shook him more deeply than the violent turbulence he had endured during the dive. Behind him, the two wingmen who had survived the descent shared the same unsettling impression, because the memory of the perfectly timed bursts and the relentless consistency of the fire control network remained vivid in their minds, even as they accelerated away from the carrier. Each pilot felt as though the ship below had not merely resisted their attack, but had actively reached upward to dismantle their formation piece by piece, erasing the familiar patterns of dive bomb doctrine and replacing them with a terrifying new reality in which the Americans dictated the tempo at every stage. The realization that they had been outmaneuvered not by superior flight skill, but by a complex and integrated defensive system, created a deepening dread that gnawed at their confidence and shook the foundations of their tactical assumptions. The commander glanced over his shoulder and saw the rising smoke from the 3 bombs they had released. Yet the ambiguity of their impact offered little comfort because the carrier's silhouette remained stubbornly intact beneath the haze, its flight deck unmarred by the kind of structural damage that would have signified a successful hit. Instead, the ship continued its steady advance, as though the attack had been nothing more than an inconvenience, a chilling demonstration of resilience that reminded the Japanese pilots why so many of their predecessors had described American carriers as impossible to finish during the final years of the war. This apparent invulnerability added a new layer of fear, eroding the fragile hope that even a single well-placed bomb might reverse the tide of combat. As the tension mounted, the surviving pilots began to recall fragments of reports they had once dismissed as exaggerations or fabrications accounts from veteran aviators who insisted that American carriers combined their defensive weapons with a sophisticated coordination system capable of overwhelming even the most disciplined attack runs. Those stories had circulated quietly through Japanese air groups, often recounted in hushed tones by men who had returned shaken from failed raids, though they rarely appeared in official briefings. Now, confronted with the reality of those warnings, the pilots felt a creeping dread arising not from superstition, but from an accumulation of first-hand evidence that validated the fears of the survivors who had tried to caution them. The commander's radio crackled with the strained breathing of one of his wingmen, who whispered that the Americans had nearly predicted his every movement during the descent, leaving him with the haunting sensation that he had been diving into a trap designed specifically to counter his instincts. Another pilot reported that he had seen a burst detonate precisely where he planned to shift his angle, a detail that convinced him the defenders had somehow tracked his intentions rather than merely responding to his position. These personal accounts, shared in the frantic moments after the dive, reinforced the growing perception that the carrier's defenses operated with an intelligence and coherence that transcended anything the Japanese pilots had previously encountered. Even as they accelerated toward the safety of the cloud layer, the psychological wound inflicted by the carrier deepened, because the pilots knew that the most dangerous phase of the battle still lay ahead, with American fighters likely already climbing to intercept them. The fear that tightened their throats was not merely the instinctive terror of combat, but the chilling recognition that they had been defeated before the dogfight even began, undone by a defensive system that undermined their confidence, fractured their unity, and exposed the vulnerabilities within their doctrine. The carrier had become not just an enemy ship, but a symbol of an evolving warfare paradigm that threatened to render their tactics obsolete, leaving them with only the grim determination to survive the desperate flight that now stretched before them. In that grim ascent, with the sea falling away beneath their battered aircraft, the Japanese pilots understood why so many of their comrades spoke of American carriers in whispered tones, describing them not as targets to be destroyed, but as predators disguised as prey, capable of turning even the most aggressive assault into a desperate struggle for survival. When the surviving pilots finally reached the safety of the cloud layer, their aircraft trembling from structural strain and combat damage, the weight of what they had witnessed settled over them in a silence thicker than the vapor surrounding their shattered formation, compelling each man to confront the reality that their attack had failed long before the bombs left their racks. The commander steadied his breathing as he navigated through the shifting clouds, knowing that their ordeal was not yet over, but already sensing that the most important consequences of the raid would not unfold in the sky above the Pacific, but in the written reports that awaited them upon their return to base. These reports, compiled under strict protocols, demanded an unflinching account of each engagement, forcing pilots to translate their visceral experiences into structured evaluations that shaped strategic doctrine. Upon landing hours later, exhausted, dehydrated, and shaken, the pilots were escorted directly to the debriefing rooms, where intelligence officers gathered to extract precise details about the American carrier's defenses, hoping to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited in future operations. The commander recounted the sequence of events with measured clarity, describing the radar-directed fire that greeted them even before they committed to the dive, the overlapping kill zones that compressed their approach paths, and the near-synchronized bursts that tracked their movements with unnerving accuracy. His language remained formal, yet beneath each sentence lay the unmistakable tension of a man struggling to articulate the magnitude of the defensive coordination he had faced. As the debrief progressed, the intelligence team grew increasingly uneasy, because the commander's testimony corroborated a pattern emerging from several previous missions reports, indicating that American carriers had significantly enhanced their fire control systems, integrating radar data, ballistic calculations, and intercrew communication with a fluidity that far exceeded Japanese expectations. The officers reviewed earlier documents from pilots who had barely survived similar encounters, noting the consistent references to predictive fire, immediate adjustment, and continuous tracking, all phrased in different ways yet describing the same fundamental phenomenon. The Americans had developed a defensive architecture that countered dive bomb tactics at every critical stage. The official summary compiled later that night acknowledged the severity of the situation, stating clearly that the dive bomber units were encountering an unprecedented escalation in defensive coordination that rendered standard attack doctrine increasingly ineffective. It noted that the density and precision of American anti-aircraft fire were rising faster than Japan's ability to adapt, and that the integration of radar with centralized fire control posed a strategic threat that could compromise the viability of carrier-based assaults entirely. Analysts emphasized that the carrier struck during the raid had suffered no observable damage, despite multiple bomb releases, suggesting either exceptional crew training or a systemic evolution in American defense philosophy that prioritized proactivity over survivability. Further examination revealed that the Americans had embraced a doctrine of layered protection in which each ship in the task force contributed to a mutually reinforcing defensive envelope, transforming the carrier from a singular target into the center of a distributed web of lethal capability. This shift explained why so many Japanese pilots reported feeling targeted even before they reached their attack vectors, because the defenders were no longer reacting individually, but operating as coordinated nodes within a network designed to neutralize incoming threats collectively. The reports underscored this point repeatedly, warning that any attempt to strike American carriers without overwhelming numerical superiority would likely result in catastrophic losses with minimal strategic return. Perhaps the most sobering element of the official evaluation was its candid acknowledgement that Japanese doctrine had failed to evolve at the pace required to confront these developments, leaving aviators trained for earlier stages of the war dangerously unprepared for the realities they faced in the Philippine Sea. The final pages of the report urged immediate reassessment of dive bomb tactics, calling for new strategies to counter the Americans' integrated defenses, though the authors conceded that Japan lacked the technological infrastructure to replicate or disrupt the radar-directed networks that now protected the enemy's carrier groups. By the time the final signatures were added, the report stood as a stark admission that the attack had not simply been repelled, it had been predicted, dissected, and countered with a level of systemic sophistication that exposed the widening gap between the two navies. For the pilots who had endured the dive, the document merely formalized what they already knew. The American carrier they had confronted was not merely a ship, but a manifestation of an evolving doctrine, one that could transform even a desperate attack into a study of inevitable defeat. In the days following the attack, analysts within the Imperial Japanese Navy began comparing the engagement with previous encounters against British carriers, hoping to understand why their pilots consistently fared better against Royal Navy formations, despite the British reputation for building some of the most resilient ships afloat. Their efforts revealed a striking contrast in defensive philosophy, because British carriers relied heavily on armored decks and compartmentalized hull construction, designed to absorb the force of incoming bombs, whereas American carriers emphasized long-range detection, predictive fire control, and overwhelming anti-aircraft density that sought to eliminate threats before they could pose any substantial danger. This fundamental difference created two distinct battle experiences for Japanese aviators, one defined by survival after releasing ordnance, and the other defined by the near impossibility of reaching the release point at all. British carriers, with their reinforced flight decks, could endure direct hits that might cripple an American vessel, yet their defensive systems lacked the layered coordination that made U.S. task forces lethal at long distances. Japanese pilots attacking British ships often reported significant structural damage inflicted even when sortie cohesion broke down, because the British approach offered attackers a realistic chance of completing the dive without being dismantled in midair. This contrasted sharply with the American model, where the threat intensified continuously throughout the descent, creating a dynamic environment in which the probability of surviving long enough to release a bomb dwindled with every second spent approaching the deck. The Americans compensated for their lighter decks with a philosophy rooted in offensive tempo and flexible defense, leveraging radar